Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. My name's Kathy Geritz, and I'm one of the curators here. So tonight is a very special evening. We're really delighted that we have William Guynn here to introduce the program. But first, before I go further on to that, I want to mention that this print of the film, a film unfinished, that we're about to see, is a film that is in our collection. Films come to our collection in many different ways, and one way is through distributors. After they've had a run of a film, they have many different copies, and they at times offer prints that are in good condition to archives. So we were really grateful to Oscilloscope Laboratories for offering us this film in a package of a couple other films. It was a title we didn't know, whereas the other works that were offered to us were films we knew. So it was really one of those special moments when we watched the film and saw what a powerful work it was, and we're very delighted to have it in the collection to be able to share with audiences like you. It's a film about film and how film is received at different times. And it's in a larger series we're doing called Reverse Angle Cinema Looks at Itself that runs through April 1st. I'm not going to say more about this series, but you can double check the program guide or the website to see some of the other works that are upcoming. As I said, it goes for a whole two more months. So in addition to sharing this new work to our collection with you, we're really delighted, as I said, to have William Guynn here to present and introduce the film. He's a professor emeritus of art at Sonoma State University, and he's the author of a recent book called Unspeakable Histories, Film and the Experience of Catastrophe. It's a book which examines how we encounter the past through film, in particular films concerned with modern day catastrophic events. That's heavy topic and an important topic, and it's a good one to have guidance through. And we get very apt and capable guidance by William Guynn. When I first got the book, I was delighted when I opened to the table of contents and saw the selection of works that he discusses. And you being our audience, I think will be the same. So 7 films, 7 directors that are very important to us here at the archive, with the addition of the Yaël Hersonski being new to us. The others, Andrzej Wajda, Andrzej Konchalovsky, Larissa Shepitko. We have works by the last 2 in our collection. Patricio Guzman, we did a residency with him, amazing to have him here. Rithi Pan, I'm sure familiar to all of you, and Joshua Oppenheimer, who went to school locally and has made some very films that really push the window of what film can speak about. So I really recommend the book and to all of you, and hopefully you got the flyer about it, but also on your way out it will be available as well. For those of you who can stay, there also will be a discussion afterwards, because as you'll see, it's a very powerful film and there's a lot to think through, and sometimes it's nice to do that with other people. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to William Guynn, and please join me in welcoming him to present this film.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I would like to begin with a statement by the Dutch philosopher Frank Ankersmit, who wrote an article called Remembering the Holocaust, in which he said the following: "There are wounds with which we should never cease to suffer, and sometimes in the life of a civilization, illness is better than health." Yaël Hersonski's A Film Unfinished was instigated by a family memory, or rather a lacuna in family memory. Hersonski's grandmother was interviewed by Ida Fink for the oral history collection at Yad Vashem, and one passage troubled her a great deal, and this is it. We escaped the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943 to a little village near town. On my time in the ghetto, I don't want to talk. Subsequently, Hersonski came upon the Nazi documentary film called Das Ghetto, produced ostensibly as a record of Jewish life in the Warsaw Ghetto in the spring of 1942. If you remember, the spring of 1942 was just the moment when the residents of the Warsaw Ghetto were beginning to be sent to the death camp at Treblinka. Das Ghetto existed as she found it, as a rough cut that is roughly edited visually, but there was absolutely no soundtrack to the film. It was discovered in a Nazi archive in Eastern Germany shortly after the war. Beginning with this terrifying propaganda piece, Hersonski wanted to recover something of the lived experience of the ghetto about which her grandmother had remained silent. And she says, "From the frenzy of propaganda, the image alone remains, concealing many layers of reality." Hersonski wants to dig into those layers of reality and expose their substance. As she insists, in every documentary, there are two gazes. The gaze of the filmmaker who chooses and frames what he or she wants to include in the film, but there's also the gaze of the camera, which sees a great deal more than the filmmaker sees. In fact, is not completely controlled, and there's always something excessive, some things that were not voluntary that emerge because of the gaze of the camera. This then is a film about a film. It's a representation about a representation. George Steiner in Real Presences tells us that, and I quote him, "All representations, even the most abstract, infer a rendezvous with intelligibility." I just love the rendezvous with intelligibility. Representations are an attempt to respond to, I quote him again, "the sheer inhuman otherness of matter, and we include in this matter our encounter with other human beings. Representations attempt to attenuate the utter strangeness of human experience, and what could be stranger and more uncanny than the images that Das Ghetto gives to us." Referring to the cave paintings at Lascaux, Steiner develops a very striking metaphor. The paintings, he says, would draw the opaque and brute force of the there-ness of the man-human into the luminous ambush of representation and understanding. Hersonski's film is exactly that it is a luminous ambush. Okay, I'm dividing my little presentation into two parts, and the first part has to do with what I call deconstruction, and it is really a work of refutation on Hersonski's part. She particularly wanted to look at the relationship between image and sound, which is very complex, and I could say in many cases it's adversarial. That is, the sound and image are doing quite different things. She wants to tear apart the Nazis' Das Ghetto, expose all the manipulation of its mise en scène, that is the deliberate staging that was part and parcel of the documentary, the virulence of anti-Semitism, in short, to unmask the perverse intentions behind this apparently transparent representation of ghetto life. The easiest way to do this would have been for her to simply attach a voiceover in which there would be a running commentary explaining, well, this part was staged, and this is the ideologies of the Nazis, and so forth and so on. And she decides not at all to do that, and instead to to adopt what I would call a intertextual approach. That is, she chooses other documents, many of them from the period itself, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, others coming from more recent observations, and she juxtaposes those texts against the film itself. And I think that's her major weapon, if I can use the word, for tearing apart this film. Okay, I'm going to give you a brief example of this to make it really clear. Hersonski makes frequent use of the notebooks kept by Adam Cherniakov, who was the president of the Warsaw Ghetto Judenrat, that is the Jewish council established by the Nazis to govern the ghetto. And here's a brief example. I'll try to just give you a sloppy description. There are two sequences that follow each other in the film. The first one takes place in the boudoir of a very rich and vain Jewish woman who is preparing to go out for the evening. There are three shots in the sequence, and they follow this Jewish woman looking at herself in the mirror in the armoire, crossing to her dressing table, sitting and admiring herself in the mirror, putting on lipstick, and in the last shot she's smoking a cigarette and gazing adoringly at her own image. And Hersonski chose a particular excerpt from the diaries of Cherniakov, and the diary entry over these images was May 5th, 1942. In the afternoon, the filmmakers were busy. They brought in a woman who had to put on lipstick in front of a mirror. Cherniakov's apartment was requisitioned all the time to show the life of these rich Jews who exploited the poor Jews of their community. Now the second sequence, also with three shots, follows immediately, and it shows you images that are clearly documentary of ghetto bedrooms with couples in a state of starvation and emaciation. It's absolutely brutal. There's a series of three shots, and at the end of those three shots, a crew member comes in front of the camera with a crust of bread and gives it to one of these dying people on the bed. It's absolutely revolting. And Hersonski continues with the same excerpt from the diary, which says, in addition to all this, there are persistent rumors about deportations which appear not to be unfounded. Commissar Auerswald ordered us to provide a contingent of 900 people. Okay, a second example is linked to the outtakes that were discovered of the film by Adrian Wood at the Library of Congress. And these outtakes are very revealing concerning the mise en scène, the staging of certain kinds of events. And I won't give you a lengthy example, but there's a sequence in the film which shows two little boys, what the French call licking the window of a butcher's shop because they're starving. And this little vignette is repeated in 4 different takes. First of all, the camera pans down and shows you the boys in front of the butcher's shop. Then there's a larger view in which you see a very wealthy Jewish woman entering the butcher's shop, and the little boys appear in the foreground, and so forth and so on. So these outtakes are direct unmasking of the techniques of mise en scène that were used by the Nazi filmmakers. Finally, there is a series of what could be termed fictional reenactments, but with a difference. There are 9 sequences that are scattered. I shouldn't say scattered. They appear at different points in the film. These 9 sequences are about the court deposition of the only member of the Nazi film crew, Willy Wist, who was identified after the war and who gave his deposition in front of a magistrate. Here, Hersonski stages the images, but is very careful to avoid any hint of docudrama, the presence of the past in the mode of fiction. Two actors playing Willy Wist and his interrogator read passages from the 4 surviving transcripts. When you watch these sequences, notice the detachment of the camera from the characters. We see them in distant long shots and in the halls of justice, or in extreme close-ups in which you get an eye, a hand, a microphone, a piece of tape recorder, and so on. The effect of this is to de-dramatize, that is, to prevent us from identifying with these characters as human beings, but to listen to the court testimony, much of which is refuted by images drawn from Das Ghetto. Okay, the second part of my presentation has to do with something that is quite different, what I call in my book historical experience. That is the way that the victims in the ghetto lived their claustration, the emotions they felt, the sensations they experienced. It is possible, Hersonski shows us, to restore, always fleetingly, moments in which the present comes to co-inhabit with the past. I'll briefly discuss 2 aspects of this restoration of experience. The first comes from the testimony of witnesses. So what Hersonski did was to invite survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto into a screening room and to show them passages, or in fact show them the entire film Das Ghetto, and to register their responses to the film, which we see very close, because you see these survivors looking at the screen, you see the projector behind their heads, you see the flicker of the images that on their faces, and then you see the images from the film that they are looking at. This is the old technique of point of view, very classic kind of structure. But at this point, Hersonski gives up totally the idea of editing things in order to show how the Nazis had distorted the experience of the ghetto residents. Here, she's much more interested in evoking the feelings that come to these people when they're looking at these films. And I'll give you just a brief example of that to make it very clear. You'll see lots on your own, of course. Okay, in the screening room, an old woman confronts the grim realism of Nazi footage of the dead and dying. The dying are lying on sidewalks, against walls, in the gutter. The image provoked a sudden rush of memory in this survivor, a short but urgent narrative. And I'll just say what this old woman says. When it was already dark and I was walking, you have images of corpses, down Karmelitska Street, which was crowded with people, I tripped on something and lost my balance. You see the witness's face. When I opened my eyes, I saw I had fallen on a corpse, another image of a corpse. My face was nearly touching his, and I was shaking. It was as if all the corpses I had previously avoided looking at were there in the face of this one man. It was a human being. And you see a third corpse lying against a building. As the witness speaks, we watch her face. She cups one eye with her hand and massages it, as if the hand could somehow take away what her eyes have just seen. I want to just very briefly talk about the Dutch philosopher I mentioned at the beginning, Frank Ankersmit, who wrote a wonderful book called Sublime Historical Experience, in which he describes the possibility that the present can come to inhabit the past. He describes this, it happens in fleeting moments, like the moment of this woman's revelation when she's watching these horrific images, but he described it as something like an ecstatic kiss. And I'll quote him. Everything surrounding us in the present is pushed aside and the whole of the world is reduced to just ourselves in this specific memory, where the memory sees us, so to say, and we see only it, the past event in question can present itself with such an unusual intensity when it was, in one way or another, incompletely or not fully experienced when it actually took place. We finish, so to say, in the present, a task that we had prematurely laid down in the past itself. So I'd like to conclude by describing this second type of historical experience that Hersonski's film provokes in the viewer without the intermediary of the witness. The effect is achieved through the filmmaker's manipulation of the image, and I quote Hersonski, "I had a few techniques I used to alter or reorient the gaze, like slow motion, pause, resize." Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht called these moments production of presence. Production, the word production etymologically means to push things forward, and that's in fact what she's doing. She's taking certain things and pushing them forward. The slow motion and frame-by-frame advancement arrest the image's fleeting character. The filmmaker dilates the images to put them in relief. Let me give you an example. During one of the sequences devoted to Willy Wist, the deposed filmmaker is defending himself, saying the Jews were frightened of the SS, there were no incidents during the shooting. His testimony stops, and what follows is a sequence of portraits of Jews, men and young boys, who are in an advanced stage of emaciation. They are framed in close-up against a neutral background. Each portrait has the quality of a mugshot, as the subject appears first in profile and then turns his head to face the camera, or starts by facing the camera and then turns aside. This is an attempt at a typology of the male Jew, a kind of perverse phrenology like those fostered by the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene at the University of Frankfurt. These are figures of misfortune, hapless, utterly unredeemable, degenerate victims of their own genetic destiny. Hersonski reduces the series to slow motion so that we have a long time to observe the faces and their unnatural movement. The subject's look into the camera is wary, grim, beyond anger. Fluttering eyelids react painfully to the light. The eyes are deadened but penetrating. We read the tragic passivity, the pathos of the faces, as an accusation that shatters the ideology of Das Ghetto. And yet something more is happening to us. Another experience of the past is taking place. The contact we feel with the subjects is intense. We are startled by these phantoms that are looking directly at us across the void of 70 years. Their faces, which could not have suspected our presence, engage with us, and we are totally absorbed by the look that was not meant for us. We look at them, they look at us. We suddenly recognize the past. That is, these faces are no longer cynical or disturbing representations in a Nazi film. We can no longer simply observe them. They are what they were, living beings, whose plight now strikes us to the depth of our souls. I would really, whoever would like to say after the screening, this film is extremely provocative and extremely intense, and I think we could have a really valuable discussion. Thank you. It's really a devastating film, and it's hard to know where to begin to talk about it. I was very struck by remarks by Timothy Snyder in Bloodlands, who revealed that visiting the Warsaw Ghetto was a tourist destination, and that there were groups of Germans who came to look at the inhabitants of the Jewish ghetto. I was also struck by someone else who documented a whole tradition of visiting Jewish ghettos. For example, during the Enlightenment, when the major question that the Enlightenment philosopher posed in terms of anthropology was, are the Jews in fact human, or do they belong to some subspecies? And there's also documentation, in fact diary entries from people who went, for example, into the ghettos in Avignon and described the terrible squalor, the horrible living conditions, the depraved nature of the Jews who lived there, and so forth. And that really affected me deeply. But I guess the question is, how does one, in fact, talk about the Holocaust? There's been, as you probably know, there's been this debate about whether or not it is justified to recount the Holocaust in historical terms, that is, using the same social economic categories to describe what happened under Hitler. And there are many people, myself included, who believe that that kind of history doesn't go very far to explaining what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. And I think the kind of history writing that Yaël Hersonski engages in is of a totally different nature, because she comes very, very close to the events, and she evokes the, how to put it, the sensations, the emotions, the daily observations of the people who lived through this absolutely terrifying time. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much. I would like to hear what you think, how you reacted to this film.
Right over so everyone can hear.
Good evening, and thank you for showing this. It took me a good deal of courage to come tonight. My name is Toni Mester. I am a Jewish American, third generation on my father's side. Second on my mother's. My grandmother's two sisters and her entire family were murdered at Auschwitz. So about 12 years ago, for about 20 years I used to do theater tours in London, and I would go to various different destinations in Europe. So about 12 years ago, I kind of, got up my courage and went to Poland. And I spent, well, first I went to Budapest because I'm Hungarian Romanian in background. And after Budapest, I took a train to Krakow. And I spent about a week in Kazimierz, which is the Jewish quarter in Krakow. And I didn't even get out of Kazimierz for about 3 or 4 days to see, the regular tourist places in Krakow, because I went around to all the Jewish sites, to the synagogues specifically, where they ran continuous footage. And I watched everything. Now, this is not the only footage of the Warsaw Ghetto, because in one of those synagogues, I saw even more stuff. And in another one, I saw the most incredible footage. It was an SS training film that showed how to round up Jews in Romanian villages. And I mean, I could have been watching my own relatives there. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to try to process this stuff. When I went to Auschwitz, they take you to Birkenau, and they take you to the old, it's like a museum. It's actually, the Polish government keeps it as a crime scene, which is what it is. It's not a memorial, it's a crime scene. And, Birkenau, you can actually climb up to the top of the observation tower and look out at what, was left after they torched their own crime and before the Red Army got there. And I swear I just stood there and looked out, and saw what industrial level genocide looked like. And I thought to myself, I will never be the same. And I've never been the same. You know, it actually, you have to go there and actually look at it. And there are many other places you can go to, you know, see footage like this. There's the Imperial War Museum, Holocaust Wing. There's the, you know, Holocaust Memorial and everything. But all I can say is, I'm not going to sleep well tonight. I knew that was going to happen, but I thank you anyway.
Any other comments or thoughts that you would like to share? All the way at the back. The question is, when was the Warsaw Uprising in relation to these events?
Well, I can't give you a specific date because I'm not good with dates, but it was later. It's toward the end of the existence of the Warsaw Ghetto. So does anyone have specific historical information? Passover? Mm-hmm. 44, yes, right. No one else? I think I feel sort of stunned silence. So anyone would like to comment on Hersonski's approach to presenting this footage on the Warsaw Ghetto? It's not simply a question of seeing these absolutely chilling scenes. It's also the manner in which she presents them and the way she organizes. She's an absolutely brilliant editor, and she organizes all of these voices to give you this kind of polyphonic rendition of the Warsaw Ghetto, in which all of these people who were witnesses to events speak in their own voice about the staging of, you know, this horrific propaganda piece. Thank you.
In the middle there. Maggie, can you wait for the mic?
It's just a little tiny thing, because I was thinking in the beginning, there were people that were, you know, being pushed into doing certain things for the camera, and they would actually meet the camera and you know, and as time went on, I didn't see that almost at all. You know, they were not you know, not trying to please anyone. They were just doing what they had to do. And whatever. I just wondered, have most of the people here gone to one of the Holocaust place, you know, sites or whatever? When I was studying in 64, so 62 to 4 to 6, I actually had you know, there was a lot of shows going on, and they were I mean, just demonstrations, and they were in a very different kind of phase than the ones that I've seen since. You know, they weren't processed or whatever, I think, and they were really, really different to my own feeling, and that was that you didn't see things that were on you know, on things that you could look at in a kind of organized way. They would have a whole thing full of eyeglasses, and right next to the one with human hair made into carpets and things like that. It was just amazing and horrible and all that, and it struck me as a, you know, that we now are offered different kinds of platforms to see these things, and I suppose every generation has to find some way to deal with those changes, even in those things, and not just in everything. I don't know, those just hit me because I don't think it's that profound, but it's just one of the things I carried with me. Does anybody else want to talk?
In the middle, can you pass the mic backward?
amazes me is that after all that happened in 1942, there was enough stamina left in Warsaw to rise up against the Germans. What was left in 1944 and what enabled these people to do what they did, these courageous things against an overwhelming German army. And this amazes me about the courage of the people in Warsaw Ghetto.
One thing that I find very disturbing is that anti-Semitism is on the rise once again in Europe. The incidence of, there are more Jews assaulted in France than any other ethnic group. And I find that really very disturbing. I don't know whether you keep up with that kind of news, but.
I was wondering if you could further elaborate on your statement about discussions about Hitler doesn't really go as far as a meaningful discussion about what was going on.
Well, I can say a bit about that. There's a wonderful German historian who taught at UCLA for a long period of time. Saul Friedlander, who said that up until one could possibly make a case that, say, the Marxist categories could apply to a certain analysis of the rise of fascism, but that after 1938, those categories no longer made any sense any sense at all, and that one could not explain what some of the strange things that Hitler did in the period after 1938 in economic terms and social terms at all. In particular, he references Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States, which was a very bad move on his part. Sorry. Friedlander also said that there were two things that he was apprehensive about in terms of history writing. The first one was that there were this group of historians who were revisionists who basically said, none of this happened, they sort of distort everything, and that's sort of one sort of way of exercising what had transpired during the war. And obviously those historians have no credibility among anyone who respects history. On the other hand, he said, there is another kind of exorcism, which is the writing of historical narratives. Because once you have written a historical narratives, you have domesticated everything. All of the experiences of millions and millions of people have been domesticated into a simple historical narrative. And he thought that was also, something that one had to fight against, because the reality of this historical situation goes far beyond anything that can be told in simple narratives. And that, Claude Lanzmann, as you probably know, thought that it was obscene to attempt to rationally historicize the Holocaust. Anyway.
Uprising began in May of. I have a correction. The ghetto uprising began in May of '43, and it ended in April. Began in April. It ended in May of '43.
43. Okay.
Did you have another comment? Can you pass the mic to her? Thank you.
I know it's 1943 because that's the year I was born.
Oh.
And I was born 2 weeks after all of I'd like to talk a little bit about the Warsaw Ghetto, which I've studied at length, but I won't bore you with it too much. But the courage didn't just come out of the air. The partisans, the communists in Poland had, made entry into the ghetto through the sewers and the tunnels and so forth, and basically armed the Jewish partisans, who were, that they were armed and fed, and there was a network, it just didn't happen. So it was a political motivation, and they lasted for a week or more because they were armed, and took the Germans quite by surprise, and it was an event. There was another concentration camp, I'm blanking out on the name of it, that was used as a model. What's the name of that place? Yes, Theresienstadt, which is in the Czech Republic now.
Right.
And I almost went there from Prague. You can go take day trips. And they also filmed there as well.
Yes.
And they had musicians and staged all kinds of things and dances and to show the world, and they brought the Red Cross in to show the world what a jolly good time the Jews were having.
Right.
And so forth. I'm not one who believes that you can't talk about the Holocaust rationally. I mean, I've lived with this my entire life. I've studied it a good deal, as well as anti-Semitism, which was, I was an English major, and I studied anti-Semitism as my kind of minor, as a literature student, and I've studied this quite extensively. I do think you can, discuss these things in a rational, contextual way. It's important to do so. Otherwise, anti-Semitism and Jew hatred in general, and hatred of Judaism and so forth becomes mystified, and it's not.
Yeah.
It's something that's understandable. I have my own theory of anti-Semitism, which is related to the Oedipal complex. It's the father religion, and people revolt against the father figure, and the abstract God is difficult for people, and so forth. The truth of the matter is the Jews are still very much an oppressed people, and most oppressed people can't speak truth to the oppressor. It's difficult because of the deep, deep fear we have of annihilation. And so part of the idea that this is, something that's so mystical we can't talk about it belies that fact that Jewish oppression is surrounded by fears of annihilation, existential threats. It's the, it's the Israeli, problem, the existential threat and so forth. But I do believe, and I strongly feel, that Jews must speak rationally about the Holocaust and not mystify it, because anti-Semitism is a real problem, and the Jews have a great deal to offer. And what did Hitler want from us anyway? He wanted Jewish wealth. And the way you can steal things from people the most effectively is to kill them.
I didn't mean to suggest that I thought that anti-Semitism under Hitler was something one couldn't talk about rationally. In fact, it's very important to talk about it rationally. And of course, Hersonski is a very rational filmmaker. And I was thinking about a wonderful book called Anti-Judaism. I don't know whether you've seen it, by David Nirenberg at the University of Chicago, who traces anti-Judaism from the ancient world up through World War II, showing that it's the same thing that's being repeated over and over again in different historical contexts. So it is something, and he's really a cultural historian. I think that kind of approach is very reasonable as a way to get at the meaning of, the anti-Judaist tendency.
There's someone right here.
What, if any, what is the, or has been German filmmakers' set of expressions about this, if any?
Say that again. German filmmakers.
Yeah, what have there been any or many German filmmakers addressing the Warsaw Ghetto or the Holocaust in general?
Oh, absolutely.
And what kind of?
Oh, well, the whole new German cinema came out of the disquiet of the new generation whose fathers had been, the Nazis during the war. In fact, Maggie, you should say something about that, since it's really your field.
Actually, lately, I've been ill, so I haven't been able to finish anything. But I've been paying not attention to the one side of the anti-Semitic thing. It's just that I'm also interested in, for example, what was said when our president was given his that's one reason I don't talk too much, but yeah, I thought that the thing that struck me about the when he was inaugurated was that almost nobody understood what he was saying, that were the exact kind of ways of doing and saying things that Hitler did.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anyone really analyzed it, but it was almost totally absent about it, and it was just totally ignorant. And most of it is, on that, from that count. And then, of course, then the whole thing, then there has to be that discourse, then, of course, with the other side of the anti-Semitism, the people who are being victimized and so on. Yeah, so I can't give you a list of the people but I can say that in my years in a small number of time in East Germany, I was always amazed at how they really made that such a present and constant kind of part of their discourse. That is of the Holocaust, and the war and all that sort of thing. And they would also, of course, put an awful lot of emphasis on people with that were. Let's see. Maybe I should cut right here. But no, it's the East Germans aren't often commonly mentioned in that, but they had a very, they had the kind of ethic that was very concerned with this kind of thing in the world and all that. Even though it's kind of different. And then the other, I think the German young people mostly, and some women and mostly men, were making films on pondering about this kind of thing for a long time, and applying various ways to place it in that. And then what I forget the name of the guy that actually has these horrific things where kids come in and kill the parents and the children of the in their home and things like that. They're dealing with things like the basic notion of what it's like to be totally without any kind of ethic or any kind of ability, and it's everywhere. You said it's everywhere, but this kind of incredibly it's very hard to understand why some people are just so basically without any kind of empathy for anyone else. Just that strikes me too as something that must have something to do with this, and it's okay. I mean, it's like our president is exactly doing that, making all of that stuff okay. I think we all know it. The only thing that I can't understand is why we haven't done anything about it, even as a simple people, or people that are, I just can't get to it. I don't know why. I thought the women's thing was very good, but it wasn't, it wasn't something that would be doing exactly what we need to do, in that thing. I don't know, but that's all going on another thing. This film was, because it was so organized, I found it was much easier to take, even though I know many people, or maybe almost all of them, didn't like taking it here. It's really tough. But to have it so organized.
call it a night.
Okay, well, thank you all for staying, for coming to the film and staying to help us all talk it through. Big thank you to you, William Guynn.